Welcome, everyone, to our afternoon webinar. CPFF is really pleased to present this webinar on BEACON-IPF, a clinical trial. It's a trial to investigate a new drug called bexotegrast, but we sometimes just call Bexo, for the treatment of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And I just wanted to let you know that on the right-hand side of your screen, there's an area called comments. And if you click there, that's where you can put your questions and any comments. And I'll be gathering them to address them to our speaker today at the end of his presentation. So we are very pleased today to welcome Dr. Greg Cosgrove, who's the Vice President of Clinical Development at Pliant Therapeutics. Dr. Cosgrove has over 20 years of pulmonary and critical care expertise in academic clinical research, and currently he leads the Idiopathic Pulmonary Fibrosis Clinical Development Program at Pliant Therapeutics. Prior to joining Pliant, Dr. Cosgrove most recently served as the Chief Medical Officer of the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation, which is an American organization, a leading advocacy group dedicated to patients and caregivers living with PF. Dr. Cosgrove also held the roles of Associate Professor within the pulmonary divisions of the University of Colorado at Denver and National Jewish Health Departments of Medicine, and has served as principal or sub-investigator in more than 15 clinical trials evaluating IPF drug candidates. He's also authored or contributed to over 70 publications and books in pulmonary research, and served as a reviewer for numerous scientific peer-reviewed journals. So welcome, Dr. Cosgrove. We look forward to hearing about your investigation and the clinical trial that you're going to explain to us.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be back working with CPFF in my prior role at PFF. We had a lot of fruitful discussions and collaboration, so it's great to be back wearing a slightly different hat than before, but with the same purpose, meaning trying to advance our understanding of pulmonary fibrosis and advocate for patients and emerging treatments for those who are suffering from IPF. So wonderful to talk to your team today. So I will go through and discuss an ongoing trial called BEACON-IPF, and it is investigating a drug that is not approved. It remains investigational to assess the safety and efficacy in patients with IPF. And as always, these are forward-speaking comments. This is a disclaimer given Pliant is a public company. I won't read them in detail, but they're available should you wish to review them for yourself. And we'll talk about maybe an introduction of who Pliant is, because I think that's important. And then also the rationale and the information that guided us to develop BEACON-IPF in that clinical trial. And lastly, go through and talk about the more specific details of that trial to raise awareness as to the importance of clinical trials in identifying and evaluating treatments for specifically IPF in this case, but any clinical trial in general. So Pliant was a company that was developed based on science that has evolved since the mid-1990s. And so with the identification of some important proteins that were believed to be driving fibrosis within the lung, the company was founded, and it's really driven with one specific intent, and that is to transform the lives of people with fibrotic diseases. I'll focus on patients with IPF, but we have an additional program looking at patients with a different fibrotic disease called primary sclerosing cholangitis. And we utilize the scientific knowledge that we've obtained over the past several decades to really precisely identify potential therapies in fibrotic diseases. So I guess simply put, Pliant is a fibrosis company. And to complement those world-renowned researchers that have really allowed us to identify candidates for the treatment of fibrosis, we've actually continued to augment the team with additional individuals to understand how the disease is progressing, and collaborate with clinicians and nurses and coordinators in the space to inform how we can work with them to design the best studies moving forward, so we can evaluate bexotegrast and its potential as an investigational drug. And as you can see, we do believe that advocacy, in this case for our annual PFF walk that occurs in San Francisco, is coming up next week. And so we're excited again to host that in San Francisco. And I don't think you can recognize any faces, but there's a lot of what we call pliant tears under the PFF arch there. It will be an exciting week because of the walk, but I would argue a month, given that this is PF Awareness Month. And so as we're designing BEACON-IPF, I'll talk about some of the pre-existing data that helped us design this ongoing study. And first, bexotegrast, or Bexo, what do we know about the drug? How is it designed with the intent of interrupting the fibrogenesis process within the fibrotic lung? Well, a key protein in any fibrotic organ, but in particular in patients with IPF, is a protein or cytokine called transforming growth factor beta, or TGF beta. And it's expressed throughout the entire body, and it's necessary for normal health. However, when fibrosis begins to occur, and in this case indicated within the lung, there's increased amounts of TGF beta that drive the fibrosis process forward, and it's out of check with normal health. And what that driving force is, what we've seen is there's an increased expression of proteins in the injured lung of patients with IPF, and they are called integrins, alpha V beta 6 and alpha V beta 1, and they're increased in two important cells that we believe are part of the process in IPF. They're called epithelial cells that line the air sacs within your lung, and also within fibroblasts, which are the cells that make the scar tissue or collagen within the lung. And our ability and Bexo's intent is that we block alpha V beta 6 on the epithelial cells within the air sacs, and alpha V beta 1 on the fibroblasts within the lung. And in doing so, we decrease the TGF beta that is driving fibrosis, specifically within the lung, because that's where these two proteins are upregulated, but we don't decrease TGF beta throughout the rest of the body. And so we limit the off-target effects and potential side effects. At least that's the intent and the design of how Bexo was really rationalized to move forward. We completed a study, and several investigators participated throughout the world, and it was termed INTEGRIS-IPF, and it was a phase 2A study. So it's really important to understand the data that's acquired from different parts of clinical trials. And I know you have resources throughout the CPFF in terms of understanding the different stages, phase 1 versus phase 2, and then phase 3. But suffice it to say, in a phase 2A study, it's really designed as the first pass to assess the safety of any potential drug that's being investigated. And so we do assess other endpoints, such as change in forced vital capacity, so how your breathing tests change with or without a drug, or other aspects. But the primary intent is really to, in a limited number of patients with IPF, to assess how they tolerate the drug. And before we even assessed patients with IPF, we had assessed it in healthy volunteers. And there were over 11 studies that were done to assess various aspects of bexotegrast, how well it's absorbed, and how different aspects and where it's distributed throughout the body. And then doing so in over between these two studies, there were over 700 participants in which we have data on the safety of bexotegrast. But in particular, I'll talk about those patients with IPF in the INTEGRIS-IPF study. And in this study, we looked at 4 different doses of bexotegrast. And we assessed patients for 12 weeks. And patients received bexotegrast or placebo. And there was a stepwise progression. So we enrolled patients first, and they received either bexotegrast at 40 milligrams versus placebo. Once we completed that enrollment and evaluated the safety profile, then we moved to 80 and 160 with a matching placebo group. So we can compare directly between those that were on bexotegrast and those that were on placebo. And then lastly was the highest dose, the 320 milligrams. And again, assess that at 12 weeks. But we actually had additional information that occurred during the study. And so for that last group, the bexotegrast 320 milligram cohort, we assessed at 12 weeks, but then also out to at least 24 weeks in that specific group of individuals with the 320. And then we waited until the last patient finished the study to evaluate all the safety. And the longest time point was 40 weeks. And as I said, the primary point of the study was on safety, but we looked at change in breathing tests with a change in FVC that I think most everyone on this call is probably well aware of. We also assessed, can we see a change in the CAT scan from baseline to 12 weeks and then 24 weeks in the 320 milligram cohort? And did it compare to changes that we saw in the FVC? And then additionally, we assess blood proteins to see if they change when a patient receives bexotegrast versus placebo. And when we assess safety in these trials, what we identify as an event is a treatment emergent adverse event. So what does that mean? It means, was there a change in your health from the last time you saw your doctor when you first started taking the study medication, which is either bexotegrast or study drug? Did you develop perhaps nausea? Or did you develop another symptom that was new, or that symptom had worsened over time? And if you did, either you report it or the physician asks you as part of the study evaluation. And then we compare those events between those that were on bexotegrast and those that were on placebo to see, is there a difference? And this is essential as to why we need to have the placebo group, because patients with IPF, obviously it's a progressive disease. And so the disease is going to change over time. And we want to make sure we're comparing these events to patients not on the study drug or not on bexotegrast to make sure we can determine differences as time goes by. So in this study, INTEGRIS-IPF, who took part? Well, there were 119 adults with IPF that were included in the study. And I'll stop here for a second to just say thank you, because this study was done in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And participants, I would say, went out of their way above and beyond the normal volunteerism because it occurred in the middle of the pandemic. Of those 119 individuals throughout the course, 88 received bexotegrast, and then 31 were randomly assigned to placebo. And we assessed them for that period of 12 weeks. And it was throughout the globe, 39 sites across North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. And we allow patients to continue to take either pirfenidone or nintedanib during the study. We didn't mandate it though, and perhaps approximately 20% of patients had elected not to be on either one of those drugs and entered the study. And as I was saying, comparing those events, and treatment emergent means from the moment you received the study drug to the end of the study protocol, were there any events? And so TEAE, or treatment emergent adverse events, were assessed for the different doses of bexotegrast, and then compared to the entire group of bexotegrast and the placebo to give us a sense. And so if you go across, you can see that there are similar rates of events: 72, 65, 63, 77, 69, and 67%. In the number of times participants said, I feel different. And that if they felt better, that's not included as an event, but if they felt a change or a worsening. A serious event is a specific definition where patients are either hospitalized or have progressive decline. And an important event, anytime one of these occurs, is the study physician says, well, do I believe this is related to the study drug, or is it something that was occurring beforehand? And so was it related to the study drug, or was it related to the underlying disease, which might be IPF, but it also could be underlying disease that a participant had before they entered the study? What we saw is that similar rate of adverse events across the different doses of bexotegrast. And then we looked to see, were there any events where the study drug was stopped? And we see that in certain cases, one was a participant who had COVID-19, so they stopped the study drug. In a different individual, we saw that it was related to a different event. In total, out of those 118 individuals, 3 participants discontinued from the study. So that's a small percentage of individuals. 2 of them discontinued because they had diarrhea, which was mild in severity. And so that informed us. One of the individuals was on nintedanib and had pre-existing diarrhea from nintedanib, which is part of its safety profile. Another individual had a predisposition to diarrhea with a disease called ulcerative colitis. The third participant was an individual who had multiple different comorbidities related to pre-existing heart arrhythmia called atrial fibrillation. And unfortunately, following an elective procedure that their physician and cardiologist elected to perform in the middle of the study, they had a progressive decline after that procedure, and the event led to the participant's death. That death was not believed related to the study medication after the review from the investigator, their physician, as well as an independent data safety board that reviewed the situation. So this is a global perspective on these treatment emergent adverse events. If we move to the next slide, the question comes, well, what were the events? What were patients noticing as we looked at the study? And so in the 12-week time period, we looked at those treatment emergent adverse events, and we said, let's set a threshold. It has to occur in greater than 5% of the participants in any one group. So if it occurs in 5% in the placebo group or in any dose of bexotegrast. And what you can see, which might reflect the underlying drugs used to treat IPF and the fact that 80% of patients were on background therapy with pirfenidone and nintedanib, is the most common event that we saw was diarrhea. And it occurred in 16.9% of patients in the pooled placebo group versus 9.7% of patients in the placebo group. Additional events were fatigue, which is part of the underlying symptoms of patients with IPF. And then we saw nausea and breathlessness. And there were individuals that had a common cardiovascular rhythm that's associated with aging called atrioventricular block. And then subsequently, you can see cough and headache. And what does IPF or pulmonary fibrosis mean? It means that the investigator thought that the patient was, or the patient said, I just don't feel as well as I did, say, 2 weeks ago, and feels like my IPF is getting a little worse. And so these events, when we looked at them, we saw that they were relatively similar between the bexotegrast and the placebo group, and there was no safety signal identified in this specific group within Integris IPF. When we looked at those exploratory outcomes, and we said, well, what occurs with the different doses of bexotegrast in terms of the breathing test? We saw that in patients exposed to bexotegrast, whether it be 40, 80, 160, or 320, their decline in FVC was separating from those not on bexotegrast, suggesting that those that were on the placebo, of which 80% were on pirfenidone and nintedanib, appeared to get worse more rapidly than individuals that receive bexotegrast. If we look at specific doses, and I highlight the 320 milligram dose, we saw that in those specific patients that there was an increase in FVC from baseline, in contrast to those that were on the placebo, where they all worsened from their baseline breathing tests. We also saw that increase at the 80 milligram dose. And so these data are encouraging for us to move forward, but they're limited in terms of the number of patients that we evaluated. And this study was not designed to specifically look at this change from baseline to week 12. But these data allow us to move forward and design a more rigorous and robust study to assess not only safety in a larger group of patients, but what we call efficacy, meaning does bexotegrast change the natural history of IPF based on a change in FVC? That's something that we need a larger study to further evidence, but these data encourage us to move to the next step. One of the questions that we sought to answer when we extended from the 12-week time period out to the 24-week time period in that one specific group, the 320 milligram cohort, was what happens to individuals who had that improvement at week 12? Did it persist and go out to week 24? And the data from the study in this limited group of participants suggested that 88.9% of individuals that had an improvement at week 12 maintained that improvement at week 24. In contrast, none of the individuals that were in the placebo group that had an improvement at week 12 maintained that improvement at week 24. So this provides information that the treatment effect of bexotegrast might persist beyond the 12 weeks out to 24, and our hope is it continues as we evaluate patients longer. We can see that and identify that treatment effect as they continue to take bexotegrast. Since you all know how challenging it is to do breathing tests, and it takes a lot of effort, there's an emphasis to try to find additional ways to evaluate treatments in IPF. And we all know that the CAT scan is a very important diagnostic tool to help patients and their physicians to make the most accurate diagnosis of IPF. But information from evaluations over the past almost 20 years, now we can utilize automated, centralized, computerized review of CAT scans and see if there are changes from one time point to another, and then assess, can we determine if that change is different between those on bexotegrast versus those that get the placebo or sugar pill. So this was another exploratory outcome, and The way the computer assessed each CAT scan is with a measure called quantitative lung fibrosis, or QLF. And this is a metric that when we looked at the change in QLF over time, we saw that a change in QLF correlated when a patient's breathing tests changed over time. And we were able to assess what's called the MCID. So what is the minimal important difference? So in this case, it's about 2%. So if your CAT scan changes by more than 2% QLF, that's considered an important clinical change, not just a variable change that we see that can happen on CAT scans over time. And we saw, when we looked at participants in each of the doses of bexotegrast, comparing it to placebo, is that those who received bexotegrast at 160 and the 320 milligram did not progress at week 12, in contrast to the placebo group or the other doses of bexotegrast. And the individuals in the placebo group ascended beyond that threshold of 2%. So we believe that their progression with placebo was consistent with the natural history of IPF, which is a progressive disease, unfortunately, that we're all well aware of. So these data allowed us to begin thinking, how do we design a study that is more appropriate to assess not only safety, but then to look at efficacy. And in doing so, then we can look at the risk-benefit or benefit-risk ratio. So the hope is always so that patients have the highest level of benefit with the least amount of risk or adverse events in terms of tolerability. So the INTEGRIS-IPF study in that limited group of patients suggested that using bexotegrast alone or those on pirfenidone or nintedanib, that it was well tolerated. And what that means is that the number of adverse events was similar between the different groups. We did identify that the most common treatment emergent adverse event, and that's we talked about before, were diarrhea, fatigue, nausea, dyspnea, the atrial ventricular block, first degree, which is common as we get older, vomiting, and COVID-19. And then in those exploratory endpoints, we saw a change from baseline in the FVC and QLF. And so that provides information to assess this safety profile, and complemented by the suggestion that there is evidence of a treatment effect in this small group of individuals. And certainly the rationale for the BEACON-IPF study is to now definitively evaluate efficacy, meaning does it help patients, and combine that with a rigorous and robust safety assessment so that we can really assess that benefit-risk ratio moving forward. So now I'll talk to you about the BEACON-IPF study, which is an ongoing global clinical trial on IPF. And as I mentioned, I won't go through this, is really we want to further investigate the potential of bexotegrast as a treatment of IPF. Right now, bexotegrast is an investigational drug that's not approved, and that's why we're going through what we call late-stage evaluation. In this case, linking a phase 2b study with a much larger number of patients, and it's specifically designed to statistically assess the benefit of bexo in the breathing test of patients compared to those that are receiving placebo or the sugar pill. We'll additionally begin in this larger group to see and assess progression of disease. And then also, and I think I don't have to emphasize that for this group, is there a chance to make patients' lives better, not just their breathing tests? So we'll assess things such as change in cough, change in your activity level, change in how well you feel, like fatigue or perhaps shortness of breath, which I think are really fundamentally important for all patients and their families that are helping care for them. So what is BEACON-IPF and kind of what is required for patients? And I'll take a step back before I go into that, is that there's an emphasis with groups such as CPFF as well as the PFF in America and the European Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation to really understand and combine the essential information that we need to evaluate any drug, but then also evaluate how much effort it takes to participate in a trial. So there are certain regulatory requirements that are mandated so that we can assess the safety of any trial and then assess the benefits. And so really want to have the sweet spot where we have enough information, but also limit the burden on patients. And so this has been informed, and we looked at the study in that regard in terms of the number of visits and the screening period. So in BEACON-IPF, 2 out of every 3 participants will take bexotegrast. So that's important because we want to make sure that we assess the safety and have a placebo group to compare it to. And then also it speaks about the ease of which individuals taking any drug. How many times do you have to take it? And what is the pill burden? So bexotegrast is taken once daily. And so we believe that makes it easier for patients to participate in any trial, given the less frequency they have to take any drug. And the duration of the study is 1 year, which is similar to other studies in this late phase, the phase 2B or phase 3. That's because the regulators in Canada, the United States, Europe, and throughout the world, that's recognized as what's called the primary endpoint of the study, meaning to show benefit, you have to show a change in the breathing test, FVC, from baseline to week 52. And that was really driven by the nintedanib and pirfenidone trials in 2014. So it's now the standard duration of evaluation. To understand that and acquire the appropriate safety information, there are 8 study site visits during the period, scheduled visits. And that's when your doctor will assess how you're doing, perform the appropriate tests, such as a breathing test, and then have you provide your feedback in terms of any new events or change in your health. So we've tried to minimize the burden for each and every patient and their family who participates in BEACON-IPF, but maximize our opportunity to acquire the right amount of information so that we can submit a package for review by the regulators. As I mentioned, the primary endpoint in BEACON-IPF is the change in the breathing test over 52 weeks. Very important secondary endpoints are the safety and tolerability, so at each visit, and then a change over 52 weeks. And then we'll look, because 70% of the patients in BEACON-IPF will be on background therapy with either pirfenidone or nintedanib. But we'll have 30% of patients who either never took one of those drugs to treat their IPF, or they perhaps started and discontinued because they were intolerable had intolerant side effects. And so we'll be able to look at, is there a difference in tolerability in those that take the study drug with background therapy versus those that take it without background therapy. And it'll inform us in terms of if there are side effects, are they more likely related to the nintedanib or pirfenidone, or related to the study drug and those medications. It'll also allow us to assess, is there evidence to suggest a treatment benefit on top of those drugs or independent? Based on the science, we do not believe that there's any reason bexotegrast requires nintedanib or pirfenidone to be treat the underlying fibrotic process. But that's the entire goal of the study, is to acquire the evidence to prove that that's occurring on top of or independent of background therapy. And as I mentioned, you may be familiar with these called patient-related outcomes. Living with pulmonary fibrosis, developed by Jeff Swiggerus, who was a colleague in Denver, where he, through questions, looks at dyspnea, change in cough, or dyspnea is shortness of breath, another term for it. And then there's another questionnaire, the K-BILD questionnaire. So these are important questions to understand the impact and change in disease. And so we've tried to limit them to the bare minimum that we ask you during the treatment course. And then, as I mentioned previously, we're going to assess the change in radiographic fibrosis from baseline, and then also at week 52. And then in the middle, we have a CAT scan at week 24 to inform us, since we are already beginning to see changes at 12 weeks, we'll have an interim review of the CAT scan at week 24. So these data complement what we see with the change in FVC, and then allow us to better understand the potential benefit of bexotegrast in patients with IPF. So who can participate? And I know this is always challenging because it's a very specific group of patients with IPF. And that's done intentionally to try to identify a very homogeneous group of IPF patients. So they're enrolled, and some are allocated to the placebo group and some are allocated to Bexo. But we know that IPF is a disease that's more frequent as one ages. And so individuals that are 40 years of age or older at screening, they have a diagnosis that's occurred within 7 years. Previously, in a lot of studies, it was 5 years. That's now been modified in most current IPF studies because we know that in patients who can tolerate pirfenidone and nintedanib, that there is a benefit, and they are living longer if they can stay on one of those two drugs. And as I mentioned, individuals can take one of the background therapies, but they don't have to. And the question is, well, what happens if I'm not taking the drug pirfenidone and nintedanib at the beginning of the study, but my doctor thinks I should start it during the middle of the study? The answer is, then you listen to your doctor and make that decision. Patients can initiate treatment during the study if they previously were not on nintedanib or pirfenidone. And similarly, if they're having issues with tolerability or diarrhea, which is not uncommon during the study, then their doctor can reduce their dose or discontinue background therapy if it's in the best interest of the patient that's participating. Again, we want to make sure that anyone who participates in a trial gets the best clinical care while they're volunteering in any study. So BEACON-IPF is enrolling right now, and there are sites throughout the world and in Canada, and several that are coming online over the next few months. And so certainly you can obtain information by going to a website that Pliant administers, clinical trials at pliantrx.com. There are also clinicaltrials.gov, which is administered by the FDA in the United States, and more specific information is available. I think that it's something that we wanted to provide to you today so that you have the opportunity to learn a little bit about clinical trials, a little bit about BEACON-IPF, and empower. If there's an interest in learning more, you can discuss it with your primary care physician and also your pulmonologist to understand any additional opportunities if you would like. And that's my last slide. So I'd love if there are any questions and I can address them as best I can.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so very much. It's a very, like that early trial, it looked very, very encouraging, the results, and I'm sure people are always pleased to see that. At CPFF, of course, we're always really interested now too that more clinical trials actually occur in Canada because there's been some issues that things are happening that our patients are not able to take part in. So that's always a really positive thing too. We're certainly reaching out and trying to have that happen more. And part of that is doing these kind of presentations where people can get a really actually pretty deep dive there into the trial and the background. And as we talked earlier, it takes many years. You said like 2015, 2014 or whatever, when this sort of work with Bexo just began. So that's, 10 years in the making to get to the phase 2B. So thank you again. It was very understandable. And I do have a couple little questions
Great.
that have come up. So a really sort of basic one was in the side effects there, we mentioned a little bit about this atrioventricular block, first degree.
Mhm.
It sounds scary, or because as soon as you see that kind of word, you're thinking cardiac. There's something cardiac happening. What is that, and how serious is it? Because I think there was 2 incidences in your
Yeah, I
early.
mean, I would say that it did not appear to be dramatically different if we look at the pooled group. And so I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it was in the entire group
Very
of
faintly, yeah.
Bexo was
Yeah.
2.2%. In the
Right.
placebo group, it was 6.5%. So there was
Less in the
less
treatment group.
common in those exposed to.
In the treatment
It is
group.
considered, it's considered a common abnormality that occurs as one ages within the heart. It is not something that patients typically receive treatment for.
Right.
So it's an abnormality on the electrocardiogram or EKG, but not a serious abnormality that requires emergent treatment.
Okay.
And in this case, it emphasizes the importance of the placebo group here, because if we didn't have the placebo group, your eye is drawn to that and you go, oh my goodness, well, that occurred in patients on bexotegrast, but then to have it counterbalanced, it occurred more frequently in patients that were on the placebo group, which means it's more likely than not just a random event rather than associated with the drug.
Right. Well, thank you for that. In a lot of the side effects too, in this list here that you're going through, and you did mention when you were presenting them that a lot of the side effects are also the side effects of the antifibrotics that we have now, the nintedanib and pirfenidone. Does it seem, or is there some speculation, or does the data bear out that this Bexo treatment on top, does it make those side effects worse? Or is the side
Really
effect?
great question.
Yeah.
Yeah. If we go back before patients with IPF
Mhm.
and we look at similar arrangement of adverse events, we saw that the rate of constipation was higher than the rate of diarrhea in healthy volunteers. And it's approximately 5 to 6%. So relatively limited number of individuals.
Mhm.
One of the unique aspects, since diarrhea is the more common one, if we look at who had diarrhea, all but one participant was on either nintedanib or pirfenidone.
Okay.
The one participant who had diarrhea who wasn't on background therapy was the participant who had ulcerative colitis, so had a predisposition and underlying history of diarrhea. So
Mhm.
those 2 data points in terms of what we saw in the healthy volunteers and what we saw in INTEGRIS-IPF suggest that the diarrhea may be more likely related to the underlying background therapy, which most frequently is nintedanib. There was one participant who had diarrhea on pirfenidone, but the vast majority were on nintedanib.
Right. At some point, you did mention when we're talking about the clinical trial that's coming up, the Beacon one, is do you know how many clinical trial sites there will be in Canada, or there are now, or how many you anticipate there being?
Boy, that would have been a smart number to have at
It's okay. You
at,
did
the,
you did
at
let
my
us know
fingertips.
you did let us know that there was going to be 8 visits. So that was one of the other questions, that how
Yeah.
many times will I need to, visit in person, like do a clinical visit?
Yep.
And that's 8 times in the year. But I
Well,
guess.
I will follow up with the exact number.
Okay.
But certainly when we looked at Canada, we looked at not just sites of excellence, but also sites that have experience that are close to patients too.
Oh, good.
So there are world-renowned leaders in Canada
Mm-hmm.
that are part of your team at CPFF.
Yeah.
But we hope to make sure that the patients that want to participate have the option. A challenge with Canada, and I would argue the Midwest in the United States, is there's a lot of geography and
Yeah.
population density occurs in certain areas, but there's still a lot of patients that live in kind of less populated areas that want to benefit. So we try to balance that.
Okay, great. And if people go on to the site and whatever, they'll have more details like that too, right? The links that
Yeah.
you mentioned right at the very end there to the
Yeah. And
clinical trial
currently,
site.
I actually got information hot off the press from my
Oh,
colleague.
okay.
There are 5 sites open in Canada right
Okay.
now
Okay.
across Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia.
Okay. Quebec, Ontario,
Thank
and
you, Jan
BC.
Ma.
Yes. Yes, I thank Jan too. She sent me your bio this day. So, and I guess how long? Like people are saying they're going to go for 8 visits. Is that like you go for the whole day? You're there half a day?
Yeah,
Or,
each visit's
or
slightly different.
different? Yeah.
And I think the screening visit is where a lot of the testing is done. So that's
Mhm.
probably one of the longer
Okay.
visits.
Yeah.
But excluding the screening visit and also that 52-week visit where we repeat a lot of things, we really try to limit it so that there's the interaction with the principal investigator. We are doing testing to measure the level of bexotegrast in the blood. That's called PK, or pharmacokinetics. And so that's a blood draw that is done with the safety labs, as well as sometimes it's done beforehand. And we it changes slightly at every visit, and that was intentional to try to limit the number of hours a patient is in the clinic. And we realized that once we breach that 4-hour time period, that's really challenging with travel. So we really have tried to decrease the visits and keep it less than that, with the exception it's kind of hard with the CAT scan at the screening visit and at week 52. The questionnaires, we assessed how long it's going to take to answer the questions, and the details of the duration of the visit and the more specific timing is listed, and the principal investigator and coordinator have that specific information that they can go over. And it's part of any informed consent, because we want patients to understand and acknowledge that, for some patients, it may or may not be something they can handle,
Manage. Yeah.
and also with travel. So it's specifically detailed in the consent as well as in the protocol.
Okay. Perfect. I think I'm good. I think you gave a really straightforward. There was a lot of questions I had before the webinar, so you've answered quite a few, and that's wonderful. I thank you very much. This obviously will go up on our website within about a week, and everything will be there, and hopefully many people will visit and then go to the site and have a discussion with their probably with their respirologist about
Yeah.
how this with them.
Pulmonologist in the United States. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, with the respirologist about how appropriate this might be, or if they're involved, if the respirologist is involved in the study too, then that makes things a little bit easier. So I thank you again so very much, and I'm sure that people will be signing up or
Well, I
looking into
appreciate.
whether they're a good candidate. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, and thank you, and to the rest of your team and everyone in CPFF. I think we are all part of a large global team with one goal, and that's really to improve the lives of patients with pulmonary fibrosis. So I think it's through events like this, working with not only Pliant, but other companies that are investigating pulmonary fibrosis. And at the end of the day, if we can identify additional treatments to change the lives of the patient and their families, that's really what we
What
want
it's
to
all about.
achieve as quickly as possible.
Absolutely, you're right. As soon as we can, and and it looks like a very promising treatment. So I wish you lots of success and hope that there's a big move forward here.